Welcome, dear listener, to our corner of stories where family love and betrayal intertwine in ways that stay with you long after the telling. If these tales speak to you, if they stir something deep inside, I invite you to subscribe and walk with us through each journey. Tonight's story bears the weight of a father's heartbreak and the silence of an empty seat at his own daughter's wedding. In my daughter's wedding, she walked down the aisle holding another man's hand while I was left outside. I was 58 years old when I stood outside the doors of the church, dressed in a suit that smelled faintly of mothballs and old cologne. My hands, calloused from decades in a mechanic's shop, fumbled with the cufflinks I had borrowed from a neighbor. I wanted to look presentable, at least for her. Through the carved wooden doors, I could hear the swell of music, the kind of grand, triumphant tune that makes people rise from their seats and hold their breath. I leaned closer, the crack of the door letting in just enough for me to see. And there she was, my daughter, my only child. She was radiant in white lace, her veil shimmering under the soft glow of the chandeliers. The guests gasped softly. Some even cried. She was beautiful. Every bride is but to me. She was still the little girl who once held my finger as we crossed a busy street. But it wasn't my hand she held that day. At her side arm, linked firmly through hers, was another man. A man, taller, broader, with a polished smile and a suit tailored to perfection. Richard, her stepfather. The one with the money. The one with the status. The one who had slowly, quietly replaced me. The guests rose to their feet, a wave of admiration passing through the pews. Phones lifted, cameras flashed. And there I was outside watching from a sliver of space, a shadow to the moment that should have been mine. As they began their slow walk down the aisle, her eyes brushed past me. Just for a second. No warmth, no recognition, only a glance, colder than the November air outside the church. And in that moment it hit me. I was not her father here. I was a stranger. I pressed my forehead against the cold wooden door frame, trying to steady my breath. The orchestra inside shifted into a softer melody, and the crowd's murmur turned into hushed reverence. I should have been walking her down that aisle. Every step she took with him felt like another nail hammered into a coffin I hadn't realized was already sealed shut. But as I stood there, cast in the shadows, the memories came rushing back, uninvited but unstoppable. I saw myself 25 years ago, holding her in my arms for the first time. She was so small that my calloused hand looked almost too rough to cradle her. I promised then that I'd protect her, raise her, love her in ways no one else could. And for years I kept that promise. When her mother left, it was just the two of us. I remember the nights I'd come home late from the garage, oil still under my fingernails, only to find her asleep at the kitchen table waiting for me with a plate of reheated leftovers. She'd whisper, "I wanted to eat with you, Daddy." And no matter how tired I was, I sat down and ate with her. I remembered her first day of high school, her nerves hidden under too much eyeliner, her backpack almost bigger than her frame. She looked at me in the driveway and said, "Dad, can you just drop me off down the block? I don't want people to see the old truck." I laughed it off, then pretending it didn't sting. But inside it was the first time I felt the gap between us widen. Still, I worked harder. I sold my prized tools to pay for her prom dress. I skipped meals some weeks to cover her college applications. When she was accepted to a school out of state, I signed papers to take out loans in my name. She hugged me crying, "Dad, I'll never forget what you've done for me." But promises made in tears often fade in comfort. That was before Richard entered the picture. The man with a house 3 times the size of mine, with country club memberships, with promises of connections and opportunity. He offered her the kind of life I could never give. And slowly, piece by piece, he took her hand from mine. Now, as I watched him walk her down the aisle, I couldn't help but wonder, had all my sacrifices been erased the moment a richer man came along the usher at the door, hesitated when he saw me, as if I didn't belong there. I handed him the invitation anyway, wrinkled from being shoved in and out of my coat pocket too many times. He glanced at it, nodded, and let me in. The warmth of the hall hit me like a wall. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above, casting golden light across rows of neatly dressed guests. Laughter echoed from the tables, glasses clinked, and the scent of white roses filled the air. It was beautiful, everything a father would want for his daughter's big day. And yet I had never felt more invisible. Every head turned as Richard in his tailored suit proudly walked my daughter toward the altar. Her face glowed radiant, framed by the veil and soft curls. She looked happy, truly happy, and that should have been enough for me. But then her eyes brushed past me just for a split second, and in that fleeting glance there was nothing. No recognition, no warmth, just absence. I sat down near the back. The whispers began almost immediately. Isn't that her real dad? I thought Richard was. No, Richard's just, well, he's been more of a father to her lately. Look at him sitting all alone. The words were daggers, but none hurt more than the sight of my daughter holding onto Richard's arm, like it had always been his place. I tried to focus on the ceremony, the vows, the blessings, the music, but my mind kept replaying years of scraped knuckles, empty stomachs, long nights, and endless work, everything I had poured into her life. And here I was, reduced to a guest in a story I had helped write. When the priest said, "Who gives this woman to this man?" I heard Richard's voice, steady and strong. "I do." I closed my eyes. That should have been mine. The hall transformed once the ceremony ended. Music swelled from a live band in the corner, tables were lined with champagne flutes, and guests swarmed the dance floor with laughter and chatter. I stood awkwardly near the edge, unsure where to place myself. Richard held court in the center of it all, shaking hands, smiling, accepting pats on the back as if he had raised her, as if he had carried her through every hardship. My daughter clung to his arm, still leaning in close, her smile radiant as she introduced him to distant relatives as the man who's always been there for me. Each word was a blow. I poured myself a glass of champagne, though I barely sipped it. My hands trembled too much. A cousin I hadn't seen in years approached, half smiling, half pitying. "Max, right? It's been a long time." "Yes," I said, simply forcing a nod. "She looks beautiful tonight." "She does." And then, as quickly as he came, he excused himself, his eyes darting toward Richard. It was the same with nearly everyone. A glance, a half-hearted word, then their attention would drift back to the man in the center of the room. I wasn't the father tonight. I was the shadow. Dinner was served, but no seat had been reserved for me at the family's table. I found a place near the back between strangers, watching as Richard made a toast. He stood tall, lifting his glass high, his voice loud and confident. "To my daughter," he said. "My daughter." The words echoed, stung, tore. May she and her new husband find happiness, prosperity, and love? Everyone clinked glasses. Everyone cheered. I lifted mine too, though my lips pressed into a line so tight they could barely form a smile. Then the cruelest moment of all, my daughter, radiant in her gown, walked past me without stopping. Her perfume lingered, her veil brushed the air inches from me, but she never once looked my way. Not even to say thank you. Not even to acknowledge I existed. I sat there, the noise of celebration around me, but inside I was drowning in silence. As the music played and laughter filled the reception hall, my mind wandered far from the noise. I wasn't seeing crystal chandeliers or clinking glasses anymore. Instead, I saw myself in a run-down apartment 25 years ago, holding a baby girl wrapped in a second-hand blanket. Back then, there was no Richard. No stepfather with a polished suit and polished smile. There was just me, Max, the mechanic who worked 16-hour shifts to keep formula in the fridge. I remembered her first steps wobbly across the cracked linoleum floor, the way she clapped when I cheered, her toothless grin brighter than any wedding spotlight tonight. I remembered holding her small hand as I walked her into kindergarten, her backpack nearly bigger than she was. She looked up at me with eyes full of trust, as if I were her whole world. I remembered patching her jeans with thread because I couldn't afford new ones. I remembered staying up all night fixing a neighbor's car just to buy her a prom dress she loved. She twirled in that dress in our tiny living room, laughing as the hem brushed the floor. She had told me, "Daddy, when I get married, you'll walk me down the aisle." And I had believed her. The contrast cut me like glass. She had promised me that role. But tonight another man held her hand. My chest tightened as the band started playing a song for the father-daughter dance. My seat at the back became an iron cage. She danced with Richard, her gown sweeping her face, glowing with the joy I had once known so well. Every sway of her body, every step they took together, felt like another nail driven into my heart. People clapped. Guests wiped tears from their eyes. They saw a picture-perfect moment, a daughter with her father. But I saw betrayal plain and raw. And in that instant, I realized something brutal. I had been replaced not just tonight, but long before this day. I thought maybe, just maybe, I could slip through the night unnoticed, sit quietly, finish my coffee, and leave before the speeches. But life has a cruel way of reminding you when you don't belong. Sir, this section is for family only. The words landed sharp like a slap. A young man in a crisp white shirt, one of the waitstaff, was standing over me. He couldn't have been more than 20, with a practiced smile that wasn't unkind, just firm. Behind him, a woman at the table whispered something, glancing at me with eyes that carried pity dressed as politeness. I cleared my throat. "I am family?" I said. My voice was calm, but it trembled with an ache I couldn't hide. The waiter shifted, uncomfortable. "I was told only the bride's parents and close relatives should be here." The bride's parents. The phrase dug deep, because that's what Richard and my ex-wife were now being paraded as. The respectable couple. The proud, glowing parents. I was just the man who had raised her through the nights no one wanted to remember. I stood my chair, scraping against the polished floor. Heads turned. For a moment, it felt as though the entire hall paused, music and chatter dropping into a thick silence. Across the room, I caught my daughter's eye. She froze mid-laugh, her smile flickering just long enough for me to see it. The hesitation, the guilt she didn't want to carry. But then Richard leaned closer, whispered something in her ear, and she turned away. My jaw tightened. I wanted to shout. "Did you forget who bought your textbooks, who sold his truck so you could go to college, who held your hand when the fever wouldn't break?" But my throat locked. Pride and shame tangled until I couldn't breathe. So I did the only thing a man with dignity left could do. I walked out. Past the tables, past the lights, past the laughter that wasn't mine anymore. As the doors closed behind me, the cold air hit my face. And for the first time that night, I realized this wasn't just a wedding. It was a declaration, a silent but brutal message I had been written out of the story. I couldn't sleep that night. The echo of wedding bells still clanged in my ears long after I left the hall. I sat at the edge of my bed, staring at my hands, calloused, worn, scarred from decades as a mechanic. Hands that once fixed broken engines, that once carried my daughter on piggyback when her legs were too tired. And now they were empty. As the hours crawled by, my mind wandered back to the first time Richard showed up in our lives. It was at Emily's college graduation. I remember standing alone in the crowd, wearing a suit that felt a size too tight because I hadn't worn one in years. I carried a bouquet of daisies, cheap but her favorite since childhood. She had once told me, "Dad, daisies remind me of you. Ordinary but steady." When she spotted me, her smile was real warm. But then he appeared. Richard, a polished man in an expensive navy blazer, standing tall beside my ex-wife. His handshake was firm, his cologne sharp. He congratulated Emily with the confidence of someone who had been rehearsing the role of dad for a while. I remember the way Emily looked at him. Admiration, comfort, maybe even relief. He offered her things I never could: connections, financial security, the kind of respectable presence my oil-stained clothes could never compete with. That was the beginning of my slow erasure. He took her on trips I couldn't afford. He slipped checks into her hands when she moved to the city. He helped her find her first job through one of his contacts. And though she still called me, still sent the occasional photo, I began to feel it, the distance creeping in, widening like a crack in the pavement that no one bothers to fix. Now at her wedding, the crack had split into a canyon. Richard stood proudly in the spotlight, while I lingered in the shadows. I leaned back on my bed and closed my eyes. Memories collided: the sound of Emily's laughter when she was 5, the sight of her clinging to Richard's arm at 28. And for the first time since the wedding, anger began to stir beneath my grief. A slow-burning anger. Not at Emily, not entirely, but at a world that measures a father's worth by the size of his wallet instead of the weight of his sacrifices. That was when I realized this story wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The silence in my house was louder than any music they played at the wedding. I sat at the kitchen table long past midnight, a single lamp burning my jacket still draped over the chair, as if I were waiting for someone to come home. But no one was coming. The anger that had kept me upright at the reception faded, leaving behind only the ache. I pressed my palms against my face, and before I knew it, tears slipped through the cracks of my fingers. It wasn't just tonight that I was grieving. It was everything that had led up to this moment. The years I spent patching Emily's jeans with thread when money was too tight for new clothes. The nights I skipped dinner so she could have enough on her plate. The mornings I dropped her at school with grease still on my hands because I hadn't had time to clean up after an all-night repair job. And she used to see it. She used to know. When she was little, she'd crawl into my lap, press her small hand against my cheek, and whisper, "You're the best dad in the world." Now she couldn't even look me in the eye on her wedding day. I walked to the small cabinet near the fridge and pulled out an old photo album. The cover was worn, its edges bent from years of handling. I flipped it open, and there she was, Emily at 7, wearing a paper crown we made together for her birthday. Emily at 12, holding her first softball glove, beaming like the world belonged to her. Emily at 16, standing by the beat-up old car I had managed to buy her with every extra dollar I could scrape together. Each page was a knife. My chest felt heavy, my breathing shallow. I clutched the album against me as though holding it could pull her back to who she once was, the little girl who thought daisies were enough. Finally, I let the sobs come. Loud, unsteady years of swallowed pain spilling out into the empty house. My shoulders shook, my hands trembled, and for once I didn't fight it. I let the grief have its way. But beneath that tidal wave of sorrow, another current stirred a question I couldn't ignore. Was this my fault? Did I push her away by not being enough? Or had the world simply taught her to trade love for security? As dawn crept through the blinds, I wiped my face with the sleeve of my shirt. I felt smaller, older, broken in places I wasn't sure could heal. Yet deep inside, a stubborn flicker remained. The love I carried for Emily wasn't gone. Bruised, yes. Betrayed, certainly. But not gone. And maybe, just maybe, that love would be the only thing that could bring her back. The sun was barely up when I heard 3 soft knocks against my front door. For a moment I thought I'd imagined it. My head was still heavy from a night of broken sleep, and the photo album lay open on the table. Emily's smiling face frozen beneath a smear of dried tears. The knocks came again, firmer this time. I shuffled to the door, half hoping it was Emily herself. That maybe in the quiet after the wedding, she'd remembered me, remembered the man who raised her. But when I opened it, it wasn't her. It was Sarah, my sister Emily's aunt. She stood there in her Sunday best, still wearing the same pearl necklace she'd had on at the wedding. Her eyes softened when she saw me. "Max," she whispered, almost like she was afraid I might break if she spoke too loud. "I figured I'd find you here." I stepped aside and she came in without asking. She'd always been that way, direct, practical, the kind of person who never sugarcoated things. She looked around, her gaze falling on the album, on the crumpled suit jacket on me. Unkempt eyes, red shoulders slumped. She let out a sigh and sat down at the table, motioning for me to join her. "You should have stayed," she said gently. "I saw you slip out of the church before the reception even started." I sank into the chair across from her. My throat tightened, but the words tumbled out anyway. "Stay for what? To watch him. Walk her down the aisle, to watch my own daughter pretend I don't exist." Sarah's face pinched with pain. "I know it was wrong. God, Max, I know." I was sitting there watching it happen, and I wanted to scream. But Emily, she's lost right now. Richard's money, his influence, it blinded her. It blinded all of them. Her words hit me hard, not because they were new, but because they confirmed what I already feared. I pressed my palms against the table, trying to steady the anger rising inside me. "I gave her everything I had, Sarah. Every damn thing. And when it mattered most, I wasn't enough." Sarah reached across, placing her hand over mine. "You are enough. But she doesn't see it now. Someday she will. People like Richard, they don't love the way you do. They buy love. And sooner or later, that kind of love shows its cracks. Her voice was steady, but I could see the glimmer of tears in her eyes. Don't let this destroy you, Max. Don't let them take away the man you are. I sat there in silence, torn between despair and the faintest spark of hope. Sarah's words planted something inside me, not comfort exactly, but the suggestion that this story wasn't finished. As she left later that morning, I watched her car pull out of the driveway and disappear down the street. For the first time since the wedding, I didn't feel entirely alone. And maybe that was the beginning of my fight to reclaim what had been stolen from me. A week after the wedding, life in the town had gone back to its quiet rhythm, except mine. For me, the world still echoed with the sound of Emily's laughter, except it wasn't meant for me anymore. I was at the grocery store, pushing a cart past the produce section, when I heard two familiar voices near the bakery aisle. Mrs. Green, a neighbor I'd known for years, was chatting with another woman. "Are you going to Emily and Richard's little thank you dinner on Saturday?" she asked, her voice bright. I froze. My hand tightened around the cart handle. "They said it's just for close family and friends," the other woman replied. "At the country club, of course. Should be quite the show." My chest burned. Close family. That word rolled around in my head like broken glass. I wasn't invited. Of course, I wasn't. But later that evening, fate delivered a twist. Sarah stopped by again, holding a white envelope. She looked conflicted as she handed it to me. "They didn't mean for you to get this," she admitted. "But one was left in my mailbox by mistake. It has your name on it." I opened it slowly, my hands trembling. Inside was a formal card embossed with gold lettering. "Mr. and Mrs. Richard Whitmore cordially invite you." My stomach churned. So they'd written my name out of formality, but never actually planned for me to attend. For a long moment, I just stared at that invitation. I could almost hear Richard's smug laugh behind it, as if he were daring me to show up. And that's when something inside me shifted. I was tired of being erased. Tired of being the ghost of a father. "I'm going," I said aloud, more to myself than to Sarah. Her eyes widened. "Max, you know what you're walking into. They'll try to humiliate you." I nodded, my jaw set. "Then let them try. I've got nothing left to lose." The decision was reckless, maybe even foolish. But for the first time since that wedding aisle was stolen from me, I felt a pulse of life in my veins. If they wanted to pretend I didn't belong, I was going to make damn sure they saw me. The invitation sat on my kitchen table for days, its gold lettering glinting under the dim light like a cruel joke. Every time I walked past, my chest tightened, but my resolve didn't waver. If they thought I would just fade into the background of my own daughter's life, they were wrong. Still deciding to go was one thing. Facing them was another. I pulled open my closet, the same one I'd had for 20 years. Work shirts, grease-stained jackets, a couple of old flannels. Nothing that belonged at a country club. My hand brushed against a suit I hadn't worn since Emily's high school graduation. The shoulders were a little tight now, the fabric slightly worn at the cuffs, but it was the best I had. I laid it on the bed and stared at it for a long time. I could already picture Richard in his tailored tux, looking every bit the successful, powerful man he wanted the world to see. And me, I'd look like a mechanic trying to play dress-up. For a moment, doubt crept in. Maybe showing up would only give them more ammunition. Maybe Emily would look at me with the same cold eyes she did at the wedding. But then I remembered the hospital bill. The $150 zero I'd taken on to save her son, my grandson. The nights I lay awake worrying about debt collectors while she was planning floral arrangements and tastings at some upscale vineyard. No, I wasn't going to let them erase that. Not again. I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, something I hadn't done in years. I wrote down everything I'd sacrificed, every loan, every overtime shift, every moment I chose her over myself. My handwriting shook, the words messy, but they were true. I didn't know if I'd read them aloud at the dinner or if they'd just serve as a reminder for me. But I needed to see it on paper, the proof that I mattered. That night, Sarah called. "Max, are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice low, filled with concern. I'm sure I told her. I've been silent too long. She was quiet for a beat, then sighed. Then promise me one thing: don't go there just to bleed for them. Go there because you want them to finally see who you are. Her words stayed with me. When the night of the dinner arrived, I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the old tie around my neck. The reflection staring back at me wasn't polished, wasn't powerful. But it was me, wrinkles, scars, calloused hands, and all. For the first time in a long while, I felt proud of that man. I grabbed the invitation, slid it into my jacket pocket, and headed for the door. The storm was coming, and I was ready to walk straight into it. The valet took my keys like I didn't belong there. He gave me a once over my worn suit, my scuffed shoes, the faded tie, and forced a polite smile, the kind that hides pity. I thanked him anyway. My voice was steady, but inside my stomach twisted. The country club doors opened, and I was hit by the warm hum of laughter, the clink of wine glasses, and the rich aroma of filet mignon. A chandelier glittered above each crystal, catching the light like ice. The carpet was thick, swallowing the sound of my shoes, and yet I felt as if every step I took echoed through the hall. People noticed. They always do. Heads turned, whispers rose like wind brushing leaves. A couple at the bar leaned close, speaking in voices too low for me to hear, but with eyes sharp enough to slice. Another man adjusted his cufflinks and smirked as if my very presence were a mistake the staff should correct. I squared my shoulders and kept walking. My heart pounded, but I refused to shrink. I had carried my daughter through nights of fever, through days of hunger. I had built a life for her with nothing but my bare hands. If I could survive those years, I could survive their stares. At the far end of the room, I saw them, Emily and Richard. Emily wore an elegant dress, her hair pinned perfectly, her laughter chiming as she leaned toward one of Richard's business partners. She looked happy, radiant even, but when her eyes drifted across the room and landed on me, her smile froze. Richard noticed too. His arm tightened around her chair as if staking his claim, his jaw clenching at the sight of me. He whispered something in her ear, and she nodded quickly, her face shifting back into a mask of practiced charm. I felt the weight of that look. It wasn't surprise, it was dread. They hadn't expected me to come. They hadn't wanted me here. Sarah's voice rang in my head. Don't go there just to bleed for them. Go there because you want them to finally see who you are. So I took a deep breath, straightened my tie, and walked toward them. Every step was a battle against doubt, against humiliation, against the urge to turn and walk back out the door. But I kept going because this wasn't about me anymore. This was about the truth. And tonight, whether they liked it or not, they were going to hear it. A waiter guided me to a long oak table set under the chandelier. Silverware gleamed in perfect symmetry, wine glasses sparkled, and the seats were filled with men in tailored suits and women in silk gowns. Every head turned as I slid into the only empty chair, just 2 seats away from Emily, directly across from Richard. The air thickened. I could feel it pressing against my chest. Richard didn't waste time. He leaned back in his chair, swirling the deep red in his wine glass, his smile sharp as glass. Well, he said loudly enough for half the table to hear, I didn't think you'd make it tonight, Max. Country clubs aren't exactly your scene. The table chuckled politely. A few guests exchanged knowing looks, and I could feel their eyes on my worn suit. I forced a small smile. I go where my family is. Emily's fork froze halfway to her lips. She didn't meet my eyes. Richard leaned forward, elbows on the table. Family? That's a strong word. But you know, sometimes family isn't about blood. Sometimes it's about who shows up, who can provide, who can fit into the life you're trying to build. His words landed like a slap. Everyone knew who he was talking about. The man who raised Emily and the man she now called father. I could have let it slide. I could have swallowed the insult like I had so many times before. But something in me refused to bow this time. I set my glass down carefully, the sound of it clicking against the wood sharper than I intended. You're right, I said evenly. Family isn't just blood. It's who wipes the tears at night when no one else will. It's who works double shifts so a child can have braces or shoes that actually fit. It's who sacrifices so someone else can stand where you're sitting right now. The laughter died. The table fell silent. Richard's smirk faltered for just a heartbeat, then returned with venom. "That's a nice speech," he said, voice dripping sarcasm. "But money talks, Max. And if I recall, yours doesn't talk very loud." This time the laughter was real sharp and cruel. I felt it sting like 1,000 needles under my skin. But instead of breaking me, it only hardened my resolve. I leaned back, looked him straight in the eye, and said softly, "Money may talk, Richard, but sacrifice never shuts up. It stays with you forever. And Emily knows exactly what that means, whether she wants to admit it or not." Emily's fork clattered onto her plate. Her face had gone pale. The silence at that table was no longer polite. It was heavy, suffocating. Everyone was waiting for what would come next. And so was I. The silence at the table stretched uncomfortably, broken only by the faint clinking of glasses and the murmur of the band playing in the distance. Richard raised his glass, his smirk returning as though nothing had unsettled him. "Well," he said loudly, signaling for the waiter to pour more wine, "I think it's time for a toast." Guests nearby turned their heads. A few raised their glasses in anticipation. Richard's voice carried smooth and commanding. "Tonight we celebrate not just the union of Emily and David, but the triumph of building a life worthy of celebration. Success, stability, respect. These are things we must honor." He paused, letting the words hang like daggers. His eyes flicked toward me, lingering long enough for everyone to notice. "And of course," he continued, "we should also remember that not every man is cut out to provide those things. Some men can only dream of sitting at this table, let alone paying for it." Laughter bubbled up again, louder, this time encouraged by the wine and Richard's confidence. A few guests leaned toward each other, whispering. My stomach tightened, my jaw clenched, but he wasn't finished. "Why, I'll never forget the first time Emily told me about you," Max Richard said, as though reminiscing fondly. "How you used to fix cars in a greasy garage, coming home with oil on your hands. Couldn't even afford new shoes for her senior prom. Isn't that right?" Emily's eyes snapped wide, panic flickering across her face. She whispered something under her breath, but Richard barreled on. "Imagine that," Richard said, raising his voice so even the tables nearby could hear. "A man who couldn't even buy his own daughter a dress fit for the occasion. And yet, tonight, she gets to live a life of grace, of beauty, of dignity, because she finally had someone to step in where you fell short." The room roared with laughter. Glasses clinked, hands slapped the table. To them, it was a joke. To me, it was a knife twisting deeper. Emily sat frozen, her face drained of color. She pressed her napkin to her lips, her shoulders stiff as if she wanted to disappear. I sat still, my hands folded on the table. My blood boiled, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of a scene. Instead, I let the silence of my restraint speak louder than his mockery. But inside something had shifted. His words hadn't just insulted me. They had burned through the last of my patience. I wasn't going to let him write the story of who I was. Not tonight. Not in front of my daughter. I could have stayed silent. I could have sat there swallowing the humiliation, letting Richard's words echo in the laughter of strangers. But something inside me cracked open. I stood. Slowly, deliberately. The scrape of my chair against the polished floor silenced a few conversations. By the time I picked up my glass, the whole table had gone quiet. I cleared my throat, my voice steady, though my heart pounded in my chest. I wasn't going to speak tonight. I began, my eyes sweeping the room. This was supposed to be Emily's night. A night of joy, a night of new beginnings. And for most of you, that's all it will ever be. I paused, my gaze settling on Richard. His smirk faltered just slightly. "But since I've already been made into tonight's entertainment," I continued, my voice sharpening, "I suppose I should tell you the whole story." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Emily's lips parted, her eyes glistening as if she already knew what was coming. "Yes, it's true," I said. "I came home with oil on my hands. I patched her jeans when they tore. I worked nights, and weekends fixing cars, not because I couldn't dream bigger, but because I had one dream only: to make sure my daughter had more than I ever did. My voice rose, carrying across the hall now. That prom dress you mocked me for, Richard. Do you know how I bought it? I fixed 3 engines back to back, fell asleep on the garage floor, and woke up with my back screaming. But when she put that dress on and twirled in our tiny living room, laughing like the happiest girl alive, I knew I had given her something priceless. The laughter was gone now. Utter silence wrapped the hall. I may not have built a company, I said, locking eyes with Richard, but I built a life for my daughter with sweat, sacrifice, and love. And tonight, when you held her hand down that aisle, you may have given her riches, but I gave her roots. Roots that you can never buy. My voice broke then, but I didn't care. I turned to Emily, her tears now flowing freely. Sweetheart, I said softly, I only ever wanted to see you happy. But don't you ever forget, before there was anyone else there was me? The man who never left your side. The man who stayed when it was just the two of us. The guests sat frozen, some with tears in their own eyes. Even the band had stopped playing. I lowered my glass, my chest rising with the weight of what I'd just spoken. For the first time all night, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel out of place. For the first time, I felt seen. The hall remained silent for a breathless beat after my words. Then, as if a dam had burst, whispers rose in waves across the room. Guests leaned toward each other, their eyes darting between me, Richard, and Emily. Some nodded quietly. Others looked down, ashamed they had laughed earlier. Emily stood, frozen bouquet, trembling in her hands. Her mascara streaked down her cheeks, but she didn't move toward me. She just stared wide-eyed like a child who'd been caught between two worlds, one of truth and one of glittering illusions. Richard, however, was not still. He slammed his champagne flute down on the table so hard it cracked, fizzing liquid spilling over his manicured fingers. That's enough, he barked, his voice echoing harshly against the chandeliers. This is my daughter's wedding, not your sob story, old man. Gasps broke out among the guests. A few of Richard's business associates exchanged uncomfortable glances. His polished mask had slipped, revealing the cruelty underneath. I looked at him, not with anger anymore, but with something sharper: pity. Your daughter, I asked quietly, but the microphone carried my words through every corner of the hall. She already had a father. She didn't need another one. She just needed her own. Emily's breath hitched and she staggered back a step, as if the truth had struck her physically. From the back of the room a voice rang out, unexpected, uninvited. It was my sister Carol, who had come despite years of estrangement. She rose, her voice trembling but fierce. Max raised that girl alone. When her mother walked out, he stayed. He worked himself to the bone for her. And you all sit here acting like money makes a father. Shame on every one of you, the hall erupted. Some clapped hesitantly, others nodded in agreement. A few stood up, outright applauding. The tide had turned, the illusion of Richard's perfect dominance cracking under the weight of truth. Emily dropped her bouquet, flowers scattering across the marble floor. Her lips parted, but no words came. She turned toward me, tears shimmering in the glow of the chandeliers. Dad, she whispered, her voice fragile, uncertain, yet laden with regret. For a moment I thought she would run into my arms. But Richard's hand clamped around hers, pulling her back, his jaw clenched in rage. You walk away from me now, he hissed into her ear, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, and everything I've given you gone. The room stiffened at his words. The mask was fully shattered now. The wealthy benefactor revealed himself for what he truly was, a man who bought love and feared losing it. Emily stood trembling between us, torn apart in front of everyone she knew. Her tears fell freely, splashing against her wedding dress. The band shifted uncomfortably, the pastor stepped aside, and the guests watched, holding their breath, waiting to see what she would choose. And in that moment I realized something. My speech had not just been about defending myself, it had forced the truth into the open. Now my daughter could no longer hide from it. The choice she made next would define us both. Emily's hand shook violently in Richard's grasp. He held her so tightly her knuckles turned white, but she didn't pull away, at least not yet. Her eyes darted between his face, hard as stone, and mine lined with years of sacrifice and pain. The music had stopped long ago. The hall was suffocatingly silent, every guest caught between scandal and sympathy. Emily whispered, her voice hoarse. You promised me family. You promised me stability. But this, she gestured with a trembling hand toward me. This is my father. Nothing you do can erase that. Richard's eyes narrowed. He's nothing. He's a mechanic who couldn't give you the life I can. You walk away from me and you'll crawl back into his poverty. Is that what you want, a life of grease and debt? Instead of marble floors and country clubs, a murmur swept through the guests, uneasy, disapproving. The ugly truth spilled into the open, like wine across white linen. Emily's chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. Tears rolled freely now, ruining her makeup, but she didn't wipe them away. My father gave me something you never could, Richard. He gave me love when no one else stayed. Gasps rippled through the hall. For the first time, Emily stepped back from Richard, his face flushed, red veins standing out on his neck. You ungrateful little... He lunged as if to grab her again. But this time my brother James, who had sat quietly in the back, stood up. He intercepted Richard, shoving him firmly away. Don't you dare lay another hand on her, James, growled, his fists clenched. The old soldier in him surfaced, the protective uncle rising where the father had been kept at bay. The room erupted into chaos, half the guests rising in outrage at Richard, others whispering in shock at Emily's public rebellion. Emily, sobbing, now ran toward me. Her heels clattered across the marble floor, bouquet abandoned veil tearing loose as she threw herself into my arms. Dad, she cried, clutching me so tightly I thought she might never let go. I'm so sorry. I should have never let him take your place. I held her, my hand trembling as I stroked her hair. You don't have to apologize, sweetheart, I whispered, my voice breaking. You just have to remember who you are and who you've always been to me. For a brief, shining moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Father and daughter reunited, truth finally spoken aloud while the gilded mask of wealth and control crumbled. But across the room, Richard straightened his suit, his eyes dark as thunderclouds. He wasn't finished. Not yet. And I knew this battle wasn't over. Emily was still trembling in my arms when Richard's laugh split the air, sharp, bitter like glass shattering on stone. Touching, he sneered, adjusting his cufflinks with a false calm. The poor mechanic finally gets his moment in the spotlight. But let's be clear, Max, you're not a hero. You're a parasite. Always have been. Gasps filled the room. Guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch the scandal unfold. You want them to believe you're a noble father? Richard's voice rose. Tell them, Max. Tell them how you begged me for help last year when your mortgage was hanging by a thread. Tell them you'd be living in a trailer park if not for my charity. His words hit like a blow. Faces turned toward me, some pitying, some judgmental. My chest tightened, but I didn't flinch. That's not true, Emily shot back, stepping between us. Her voice cracked, but she stood tall. Dad never begged you for anything. You threw money around to make yourself look like a savior when all you really wanted was control. Control over me, over our family, over everything. Richard's eyes blazed. Ungrateful girl. You think this man, he jabbed a finger at me, spit flying with his words, deserves to stand beside you. He couldn't even afford to buy you your first car. Every luxury you've ever known came from me. The crowd stirred, some whispering in agreement, others shaking their heads in disgust. I finally spoke, my voice steady, low, but firm enough to carry through the room. You're right, Richard. I didn't buy her cars or diamonds. What I gave her was meals when I had nothing left for myself. Nights working double shifts so she could stay in school. Shoes patched with my own hands when we couldn't afford new ones. Maybe that doesn't shine like gold, but it lasts longer. For a moment, silence reclaimed the hall. Emily's shoulders shook, tears streaming as she gripped my hand tighter. Richard's face twisted with rage. You think love pays the bills? You think sentiment wins respect? Look at you, 58, broke, living off scraps. You're an embarrassment enough, James barked, stepping forward again. His voice carried the weight of command, silencing the whispers. I've seen men with money and no honor. Richard, you're one of them. And I'd take my brother's calloused hands over your bloody checkbook any day. The audience erupted, some clapping softly, others glaring at Richard. Richard's composure cracked. His fists clenched, his jaw flexed. "This isn't over," he spat. "Not for you, Max. Not for her." And with that, he stormed out of the hall, slamming the doors so hard the chandeliers rattled. Emily clung to me, sobbing into my chest. But even as I held her, I knew Richard's exit wasn't defeat. It was a warning. He'd be back, and next time he'd come prepared to destroy me. The wedding reception never truly recovered. The music started up again. The caterers served their meals, and people tried to dance, but the shadow of Richard's outburst lingered like smoke after a fire. Guests whispered in corners, phones buzzed with texts, and I could feel eyes following me wherever I went. Emily stayed close by my side, her new husband supporting her as she tried to enjoy what was supposed to be the happiest night of her life. But even in her smile, I could see the strain, the guilt pressing heavy on her shoulders. Later that night, after the last guest drifted home, I walked out into the cool air of the parking lot. The night was quiet, the stars spread wide across the sky. For the first time in years, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. That's when I saw him. Richard was leaning against his black luxury car, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. His tie hung loose around his neck, and his face, though calm, carried a cruel smirk. "You think you won today?" he said, flicking ash to the ground. "But you're wrong." I stopped a few feet away, saying nothing. "You embarrass me in front of everyone," Richard continued, his tone low and deliberate. "And that doesn't sit well with men like me. You don't get to humiliate Richard Lawson without consequences." I clenched my fists, but kept my voice steady. "I don't want a war with you, Richard. All I want is to be a father to my daughter." He laughed coldly. Fathers provide. Fathers don't live in broken-down houses and patch cars for pennies. I'm the one who gave her opportunity. I'm the one people respect. You're a relic, and I'll make sure everyone knows it." I felt the air tighten around me as his words cut. Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice. "By Monday morning, I'll have every bank, every business in town questioning your name. You'll find doors closing that you didn't even know were open. And Emily, she'll see what kind of man you really are, a liability." With that, he tossed the cigarette, crushing it under his shoe before slipping into his car. The engine roared, headlights flaring as he sped off into the night. I stood there, frozen, heart pounding. I'd faced hardship before, debts, layoffs, empty cupboards, but this was different. Richard wasn't threatening just my dignity. He was threatening to erase me. When I finally walked back inside, Emily looked at me with worried eyes. "Dad, what did he say?" I forced a smile, though my stomach twisted with dread. "Nothing you need to worry about tonight," I whispered, kissing her forehead. But in my mind, I knew Richard was already planning his next strike. And this battle was far from over. The following Monday, the world seemed colder, sharper, as if Richard's words had followed me home and seeped into the walls of my house. I woke before dawn, made myself a pot of black coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with a heaviness in my chest. At 7 a.m., the phone rang. It was Joe, an old friend from the auto shop where I picked up side jobs. "Max, I don't know what's going on, but we can't have you here anymore," Joe said, his voice heavy with regret. "Somebody called. Said you're unreliable, that you've got a history of poor work. The owner doesn't want any trouble." I felt my stomach drop. "Joe, you know my work. You know I've never cheated a soul in my life." "I do," he whispered. "But the owner doesn't care." "I'm sorry, Max. My hands are tied." Click. The line went dead. Before I could even set the phone down, a knock rattled the front door. When I opened it, 2 men in suits stood on the porch, briefcases in hand. "Mr. Carter," one asked, holding up a badge. "We're from First National Bank. We need to discuss your mortgage." I blinked. "Mortgage, my payments are up to date." The man flipped open a folder. "According to our records, a review of your financial history has been initiated. We've received reports suggesting inconsistencies in your income verification." Reports. My jaw tightened. "Richard." As they spoke in calm, practiced voices, I realized this wasn't about numbers. This was about pressure. Richard was pulling strings, setting fire to every corner of my already fragile life. By noon, the storm had spread further. At the grocery store, neighbors whispered. At the diner, a waitress I'd known for years looked at me differently, her smile forced. Rumors were running wild. I was broke, unstable, even dangerous. When I returned home that evening, Emily was waiting on the porch. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she held out her phone. Dad, look. On the screen was the social media post photos from the wedding. One of me standing awkwardly outside the church doors, compared side by side with Richard walking Emily proudly down the aisle. The caption read, "Some men deserve the title of father. Others don't." It had thousands of likes, hundreds of comments. People I didn't even know were laughing at me, calling me a failure. I felt my chest burn, but when I looked at Emily's tearful eyes, I forced myself to steady. Dad, I'm so sorry. I never wanted this. She gripped my arm desperately. Richard's trying to destroy you. I put my hand over hers. He can take my job, my reputation, even the respect of strangers. But Emily, he cannot take you from me, not unless you let him. She broke, then burying her face against my chest. I won't, Dad. I won't let him win. As I held her, I felt a flicker of something stir inside me. Richard had money, power, and influence. But I had something he would never understand, the love between a father and daughter that no amount of manipulation could erase. And for the first time since the wedding, I realized this wasn't the end of my story. It was only the beginning of the fight. The days that followed were some of the darkest of my life. Richard's shadow seemed to stretch into every corner of my existence. The phone calls stopped coming. Side jobs vanished. Even the mechanic who used to greet me with a firm handshake now avoided my eyes, mumbling something about not getting involved. At night, I lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, my chest heavy with the weight of it all. The whispers in town weren't just words anymore. They were knives cutting deeper with every passing day. But what broke me most wasn't the gossip. It was the silence. Emily hadn't called in nearly a week. After that night on the porch, she had promised to stand by me. Yet the days stretched on empty, her absence gnawing at me like an open wound. One evening, I found myself sitting alone at the kitchen table, bills spread out like a battlefield. The numbers were merciless: medical debt, mortgage, utilities. My hands trembled as I tried to add them up, the ink blurring through my tears. For the first time in years, I felt utterly defeated. I pressed my palms to my face. What am I doing? Maybe Richard's right. Maybe I am just a failure. The words tasted bitter like poison. Then the phone rang. I nearly ignored it, thinking it was another collector, another reminder of my downfall. But when I picked up, a familiar voice rasped on the other end. Max, it's Frank. Frank, my oldest friend from the factory days. We hadn't spoken in years, not since he'd moved 3 towns over. I heard what's going on, Frank said, his tone sharp with anger. Don't hang up. You listen to me. Richard's got deep pockets, sure, but he doesn't know what real respect is. And you've still got people who know the kind of man you are. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. Frank, he's destroying everything. I don't know how to fight a man like him. You don't fight him alone, Frank said firmly. You stand up and we stand with you. That's how you do it. For the first time in weeks, I felt a crack of light pierce through the darkness. My hand still shook. But now it wasn't just fear, it was adrenaline, something alive stirring inside me. I ended the call and sat back in my chair, breathing deeply. Richard had taken my work. My pride even tried to take my daughter. But he hadn't taken everything. Not yet. And as long as I had a breath left in me, I wasn't going to let him win. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. For weeks, I had dragged myself out of bed like a man carrying stones on his back. But that day was different. Frank's words still rang in my ears like a bell I couldn't ignore. You don't fight him alone. I sat at the kitchen table, coffee in hand, and stared at the stack of bills. The debt hadn't gone anywhere. My loneliness hadn't vanished overnight. But something inside me had shifted. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt a flicker of purpose. By noon, I was in my truck, heading across town. Frank was waiting for me at a diner, the same one we used to hit after late shifts at the factory. His hair was grayer now, his frame heavier, but his eyes were just as sharp. "You look like hell," Frank said as I slid into the booth. "Good," I muttered. "Means I've got nothing left to lose." Frank chuckled, then leaned closer. "I've talked to some of the old crew. The guys from the shop, a few from the union. They all heard what Richard did at the wedding. They're pissed, Max. They say it's about time someone stood up to him." My chest tightened. These were men who'd known me for decades, who'd seen me work double shifts just to put food on the table. If they still believed in me, maybe I wasn't as broken as I thought. "But what can we do?" I asked. "He's got money connections, the whole town eating out of his hand." Frank slammed his fist on the table. "Money can buy silence, Max, but it can't buy truth. And you've got the truth. You raised Emily alone after her mother passed. You worked yourself to the bone for that girl. People need to hear your side of the story." I stared at him, the words sinking in. For so long I'd swallowed my pain, thinking silence was the only way to keep peace. But peace had been shattered anyway. Maybe it was time I stopped hiding. That evening I drove to Emily's house. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, my throat dry. I wasn't there to beg or plead anymore. I was there to be heard. Emily opened the door, her eyes widening. "Dad, what are you doing here?" I steadied myself. Behind her I saw Richard lounging on the couch, sipping whiskey, smirking, as if he owned the place, which in his mind he probably did. I drew a deep breath, my voice steady. "I've been quiet too long. Emily, you need to know the truth. About me. About him. And I'm done letting this man erase me from your life." Her face paled, torn between shock and confusion. Richard's smirk faltered for the first time. And in that fragile silence I realized something: the power was shifting. For the first time in a long time, Richard looked uneasy. The battle wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning.